History often forgets its most ruthless architects, mostly because they engineered it that way, never seeking public office or military glory. Yet, for nearly 10 years, this obscure figure exerted greater influence over the globe's trajectory than any democratically elected leader in America. He orchestrated the collapse of free nations across 2 continents and triggered covert conflicts that completely reshaped international borders. He even greenlit psychological human testing so terrifying it belongs in a science fiction nightmare. His influence bled deeply into American media, with highly respected reporters secretly acting as his personal mouthpieces for years. When a sitting commander-in-chief attempted to restrict his authority, that leader was murdered, and our operative was inexplicably assigned to investigate the assassination. That man was Allen Welsh Dulles, an unassuming corporate attorney who systematically constructed America's clandestine empire from the shadows. But to truly comprehend Dulles, we must examine the environment of his youth, as his immense influence was inherited, not randomly acquired. Entering the world on April 7, 1893, in Watertown, New York, he was raised by a clergyman father with deep governmental ties. His lineage was steeped in elite diplomacy, starting with his maternal grandfather, John Watson Foster, who directed foreign affairs for President Benjamin Harrison. The family connections continued with his uncle, Robert Lansing, who secured the exact same cabinet position under the Woodrow Wilson administration. He was a place for a mission to take care of the man. Ultimately, his older sibling, John Foster Dulles, would rise to become one of the most dominant diplomatic figures of the 20th century. In Washington circles, the Dulles name commanded ultimate respect, representing the deeply entrenched, old money foundation of the nation's international strategy. From a very young age, Allen instinctively absorbed this elite atmosphere, treating international statecraft as his natural birthright. He pursued his higher education at Princeton University, securing his degree in 1916 before immediately diving into the Seine trial and draw upon his personal grandfather. Diplomatic service without delay, he was quickly stationed in Bern, Switzerland for his very first assignment. While the Swiss capital appeared peaceful on the surface, this exact posting would permanently mold his approach to espionage. He appeared in www.com.edu and then smiled away to a villain boat. In reality, Bern, in 1917, was incredibly tense, as the devastating chaos of the First World War engulfed the surrounding continent. Safe behind its neutral borders, the country transformed into a thriving epicenter for spies, exiled revolutionaries, and shadowy negotiations. Operatives from every major global power walked those streets, and the young American diplomat found himself plunged right into the middle of the action. Decades later, he would frequently recount a specific story from this era to fresh CIA recruits, using it as a vital cautionary tale. On April 8, 1917, a Russian exile residing in Bern called the American legation, desperately pleading for an urgent face-to-face meeting. However, the 24-year-old Allen had already scheduled a tennis match for that afternoon, so he flatly rejected the man's request. "Please publish your society by letting people go back." Just one day later, that exact Russian émigré was expelled from Swiss territory and loaded onto a highly secured train headed for St. Petersburg. The caller he dismissed was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, a man the rest of the world would soon come to know as Vladimir Lenin. Mere months after that phone call, Lenin orchestrated the Bolshevik Revolution, violently shattering and rebuilding the entire global political landscape. That terrible misjudgment haunted Allen indefinitely, transforming into a fundamental rule that he relentlessly hammered into every spy he ever commanded. He strictly warned them to never reject a potential informant, famously noting, "You never know when you're speaking with someone who might change the world. I would think peace of myself is possible to ask you whether you could be part of that." Eventually recovering from the devastating 1918 influenza, Allen traveled to the Paris Peace Conference, watching the triumphant Allies ruthlessly slice up the post-war globe. Teaming up with his older brother, he witnessed firsthand how international boundaries were brutally redrawn, and millions of citizens were traded like mere bargaining chips. Observing these secretive meetings between major powers gave him a profound realization that would guide his entire life. KMHMPH.org. He finally understood that the most critical choices dictating the fate of countries are never actually made in the public eye. He considered the latest of death and life BTs. Fast forward to 1921, while posted at the US Embassy in Istanbul, he played a key role in uncovering a massive lie. He was deeply involved in proving that the notorious protocols of the Elders of Zion was nothing more than a complete fabrication. Eager to act, he aggressively urged the State Department to openly condemn the fake text, but his bosses flatly rejected the idea. This frustrating roadblock introduced him to the deep bureaucratic stagnation and ethical weakness that plagued government organizations. It was a harsh reality he would spend his future years either aggressively combating or strategically manipulating to his advantage. Shifting gears, by 1926, he stepped away from his diplomatic duties to secure a law degree from George Washington University. Soon after, he joined Sullivan and Cromwell, an elite Wall Street law firm where his older brother was already a top partner. This establishment was far from ordinary. It functioned as the absolute command center for expanding American corporate dominance overseas. They defended the interests of massive global corporations, specifically focusing on businesses holding extensive and crucial financial ties to Germany. Throughout the 20s and 30s, his firm operated as the vital hub for international banks, desperately reconstructing a post-war Germany. They directly facilitated the massive deals that allowed American funds to account for nearly 70% of Germany's financial influx. Allen personally managed the legal affairs for several German industrial giants, including the incredibly wealthy banking networks of the Thyssen family. Commissionaires Henry Conté, de cette rentrée des travailleurs. Disturbingly, reports also linked him to IG Farben, the colossal chemical syndicate destined to produce the lethal gas deployed in the Holocaust. John Foster's involvement ran even deeper, meticulously crafting agreements that pumped American capital directly into German enterprises. Even as Hitler seized absolute control, Foster stubbornly refused to shutter the firm's lucrative Berlin headquarters. Allen, however, firmly opposed his brother. After a 1935 visit to Germany, left him horrified by the rampant anti-Semitism. He spearheaded an internal campaign at the firm, successfully terminating their direct corporate presence in the Nazi state. Yet, the complex financial nets connecting Wall Street to Germany's industrial powerhouse were already inextricably tangled. Curiously, 2 years prior in 1933, Dulles had actually sat down with Adolf Hitler in the German capital. He subsequently penned a letter to Foster, insisting that the newly formed regime was not quite as bad as some alarmists suggested. Following that letter, Dulles almost never uttered a single word about his encounter with the dictator again. Years later, future CIA head Richard Helms voiced absolute disbelief that his former superior had kept such a meeting completely hidden. This bizarre contradiction formed the very core of Dulles's complicated and often deeply unsettling narrative. He could display sincere disgust at the persecution of Jewish citizens, only to casually brush off the regime's systemic savagery moments later. He was never a true believer in any ideology. He was a pure pragmatist, a trait that made him exceptionally dangerous. As the globe finally plunged into the chaos of the Second World War, Dulles ultimately discovered his true vocation. While attending a 1940 political convention, he crossed paths with William Donovan, an old contact establishing America's pioneer intelligence network. Donovan pitched him the idea of joining the nascent OSS, setting the stage for his entry into the Shadow War just before Pearl Harbor. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, he eagerly embraced the chance to serve. He was deployed to Bern, Switzerland, stepping into the role of OSS station chief in the exact city where his diplomatic journey began 25 years prior. In November 1942, he sneaked past the French border mere hours before German forces locked it down following the Allied push into North Africa. By a hair's breadth, he became the final US official to make it into Swiss territory before the perimeter was completely barricaded. For the following 2.5 years, he worked deep within hostile territory, commanding what was likely the war's most critical espionage outpost. At the time, Bern was teeming with an eclectic mix of double agents, desperate refugees, and underground fighters from every side of the global conflict. We are only aware that crossing them still busy. He absolutely flourished in this chaotic atmosphere, assembling a massive web of sources ranging from dissenting Nazi officers to wealthy European bankers. However, his tradecraft was far from flawless, especially since he possessed a notoriously dismal track record when it came to concealing his own cover. Merely weeks into his deployment, local Swiss publications had already publicly exposed his true identity as an American operative. Furthermore, a portion of the secrets fed to him by his German associates turned out to be carefully crafted enemy deception. Nevertheless, he secured monumental triumphs, including gathering pivotal data regarding the enemy's highly classified V-1 and V-2 missile initiatives. This priceless intelligence directly guided Allied bombing runs against advanced Nazi weapon plants, successfully delaying their rocket production by crucial months. Tonight, for 4,1256 choice documents delighted alongside military secrets, his desk also received chilling dispatches detailing the systematic slaughter occurring inside the camps at Auschwitz. He simultaneously nurtured ties with underground German dissidents, forging bonds with the very individuals secretly plotting to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Although his superiors strictly prohibited any formal pacts with these rebels, they continuously supplied him with irreplaceable insights regarding the internal state of the Nazi Empire. Yet his most famous triumph of the entire war arrived just as the global conflict was finally drawing to a close. By early 1945, with the Nazi regime rapidly crumbling, he quietly opened back-channel discussions with SS General Karl Wolff. The goal of these highly sensitive talks, dubbed Operation Sunrise, was to secure the immediate surrender of German troops across Italy and southern Austria. This mission required extreme secrecy, especially from the Soviets, who would explode in anger over any unilateral Western agreement with the enemy. Inevitably, Stalin discovered the plot and fiercely accused his British and American allies of sneaking behind his back to broker a separate peace. This intense paranoia almost triggered a catastrophic diplomatic breakdown between the major Allied powers right before the war's end. Braving the immense political fallout, the clandestine talks ultimately paid off when Axis troops in Italy officially surrendered on May 2, 1945. Occurring almost a full week before Germany's total collapse, this early surrender spared countless thousands of lives that would have been lost in pointless bloodshed. When the dust eventually settled, he stood as one of the most highly regarded minds within the American intelligence community. These have unfortunately manifested mask evasion. Having survived the dangerous fieldwork, he had successfully assembled an unparalleled web of vital global informants. Furthermore, he showed a brilliant knack for high-stakes, ethically questionable compromises that would perfectly foreshadow his future career moves. However, a much more sinister shadow hung over his wartime record, a dark secret that remained buried for several decades. With Germany facing certain defeat, he and his former law firm actively assisted wealthy German tycoons in smuggling their fortunes out of the country. This operated in a disturbing moral gray area, considering many of these businessmen had built their empires using horrific slave labor under the Nazi regime. Following the conflict, he pulled strings to protect these unsavory contacts from the Nuremberg trials, including extending his protection to SS General Karl Wolff. Wolff was actually Heinrich Himmler's right-hand man and held deep, undeniable responsibility for the horrors of the Holocaust. Yet, thanks entirely to this powerful intervention, the high-ranking officer completely dodged the post-war tribunals. Shielding valuable operatives, absolutely regardless of their dark pasts, quickly became his signature strategy in the espionage world. This chilling, highly calculated methodology would soon echo far beyond Europe, unleashing massive and lasting global repercussions. Following the devastation of World War II, the geopolitical landscape completely fractured into two heavily militarized factions. Washington and Moscow abruptly abandoned their wartime alliance, plunging headfirst into a terrifying battle for worldwide supremacy. To combat this rapidly escalating Soviet threat, the American defense and espionage apparatus began expanding at breakneck speed. This intense growth ultimately led to the 1947 National Security Act, effectively bringing the Central Intelligence Agency into existence. Right from its absolute infancy, Dulles had his hands deeply involved in molding the structure of this secretive organization. After evaluating the country's espionage capabilities, he officially entered the CIA in 1951 to oversee all clandestine missions, but the ultimate turning point arrived 2 years later, in 1953, when Dwight D. Eisenhower officially took power. The newly elected president appointed John Foster, Allen's own brother, to serve as the nation's Secretary of State. Concurrently, Allen was elevated to Director of Central Intelligence, making history as the very first civilian to claim that title. For the first time ever, a single pair of siblings commanded both the public and hidden machinery of America's global agenda. While his brother managed open diplomacy, Allen thrived in the shadows, wasting absolutely no time weaponizing this unprecedented authority. As CIA director, his initial major undertaking involved orchestrating the downfall of Iran's democratically chosen leadership. The conflict traced back to 1951, when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh boldly nationalized his nation's lucrative petroleum industry. For decades prior, this massive wealth had been entirely monopolized by a British corporation, the precursor to modern-day BP. Far from being a communist, Mossadegh was a passionate patriot who simply believed his country should own its natural resources. The Book of Not Over Code. Outraged by this loss of control, British authorities immediately turned to the United States, begging for assistance to depose him. Pirates contended to affect Europe's Denver Princess Starlight King. While President Truman had previously hesitated to intervene out of respect for Iranian independence, the new leadership felt differently. Under Eisenhower, the Dulles brothers analyzed every global conflict exclusively through the paranoid framework of the Cold War. Knowing this, British diplomats masterfully manipulated American anxieties, insisting the crisis was actually about stopping a communist takeover, not protecting oil. They warned that unless Mossadegh was crushed, Iran would inevitably slide into Soviet control, dragging the whole Middle East down with it. Convinced by these threats, Allen quickly greenlit $1 million starting budget in April 1953 to launch the infamous Operation Ajax. American operatives systematically bribed local journalists, religious leaders, and politicians to relentlessly slander the Prime Minister in the public sphere. The agency flooded the country with fabricated news, labeling him a Soviet ally, while simultaneously funding military defectors and staging violent riots. Theodore Roosevelt's own grandson, Kermit, directed these covert ground maneuvers, acting as a seasoned intelligence officer with almost total independence. However, their initial coup attempt in mid-August was a catastrophic failure, as loyalist military units stood firm and instantly exposed the conspiracy. Terrified by the immediate backlash, the Iranian Shah, who had just authorized the dismissal, panicked and hastily fled his own kingdom. Back at American intelligence headquarters, sheer panic set in as superiors urgently messaged their field commander to abort the mission immediately. Their strict directive warned that the plot was completely burned, demanding a full withdrawal to prevent any direct links back to Washington. Kalyan Philippis was joined by his father after he announced, defying his superiors, the rogue agent blatantly ignored the retreat command and frantically gathered his remaining bought-off crowds and rebel soldiers. But the last failure he apparently agreed. Just 4 days after the initial collapse, massive riots suddenly consumed the capital's streets, violently shifting the momentum back in their favor. Surging crowds, secretly bankrolled by the agency, overtook the city squares, prompting hesitant army battalions to finally join the ongoing rebellion. The democratic leadership rapidly crumbled under the assault, paving the way for the monarch's return, though nearly 300 lives were lost in the carnage. The party could report that there was just the left two secrets to return. The ousted prime minister was quickly captured, convicted of betrayal, and condemned to prison, followed by permanent confinement in his own home. To cement his absolute authority, the restored ruler unleashed a terrifying secret police unit, heavily schooled by foreign intelligence experts in ruthless tactics. Foreign petroleum corporations eagerly swooped in to claim lucrative new contracts, permanently anchoring the nation as a crucial Western asset against the Soviets. However, this foreign-backed tyranny sowed a toxic seed, quietly cultivating an intense, seething hatred toward the monarch among the oppressed local population. Decades later, that boiling anger spectacularly erupted into a fundamentalist uprising, culminating in furious militants storming the foreign embassy and taking hostages. Out of the ashes rose a strict religious state that would fiercely oppose Western influence, remaining a bitter global rival long into the future. It took 60 years for American intelligence to officially confess their involvement, proving that the director's inaugural shadow operation left permanent global scars. Emboldened by what he viewed as a spectacular triumph in the Middle East, the ambitious spy master immediately shifted his crosshairs toward Central America. There, a legally chosen leader was actively rolling out progressive reforms, unwittingly painting a massive target on his back for the agency's next strike. Known as Decree 900, this ambitious initiative specifically seized unused acreage from massive estates to give impoverished farmers a chance to cultivate their own plots. Owners received payouts matching their self-reported property taxes, and overall, this sweeping policy barely touched a fraction of the nation's total agricultural properties. However, a major hurdle emerged in the form of an American corporate giant, the United Fruit Company, which possessed vast tracts of entirely unplanted territory. The Guatemalan government repossessed a significant portion of that dormant property, issuing a $1 million payout that perfectly mirrored the corporation's own undervalued tax documents. Infuriated by having their own tax evasion used against them, the corporate executives furiously rejected the offer, insisting their holdings were actually worth $25 million. But without making this increasingly happy, The retail content has come to a few people around them. This is exactly where the narrative takes a highly unethical turn, as the men running American foreign policy were hardly objective bystanders in this dispute. Both siblings had previously worked as partners at the exact law firm representing United Fruit, with the intelligence chief even having held a board seat. The corruption ran incredibly deep, as multiple high-ranking State Department officials and the U.S. ambassador to the UN all possessed lucrative shares in the corporation. Even the National Security Advisor was a former corporate director, making these blatant financial conflicts of interest both utterly shocking and brazenly out in the open. To protect their investments, the brothers immediately spun the Central American dispute using the terrifying, universally understood rhetoric of the ongoing global superpower rivalry. They aggressively painted the reformist president as a dangerous radical, baselessly declaring he was a covert socialist, steering his nation straight into Soviet hands. They deliberately ignored the reality that the country's actual radical left consisted of barely 4,000 registered individuals out of a population of 3 million. They also conveniently brushed aside the undeniable fact that these very agricultural reforms were heavily inspired by standard, everyday, capitalist principles from the United States. But the truth didn't matter. The terrifying propaganda narrative had successfully taken root, and the gears of the covert intervention machine began rapidly grinding forward. Consequently, the intelligence agency officially ignited Operation PB Success in 1954, bankrolling the covert coup with a massive multi-million-dollar slush fund. More than 100 intelligence operatives orchestrated the plot, secretly establishing hidden military training camps in neighboring Honduras and Nicaragua. They enlisted an exiled Guatemalan officer named Carlos Castillo Armas to command a rebel faction, outfitting them with guns and vintage World War II aircraft. Operating in the shadows, the agency simultaneously unleashed a fierce psychological assault, sneaking hostile anti-government propaganda directly into local newspapers. Operatives even managed to convince rural clergymen to weave fierce political attacks against the president directly into their Sunday sermons. A clandestine radio network was activated to saturate the airwaves with deceptive broadcasts while deliberately blocking official state communication channels. Taking an even darker turn, the agency compiled target lists and drafted its earliest known manuals on how to eliminate top government officials. When Castillo Armas finally breached the border on June 18, 1954, his invading force consisted of just a few hundred men. By any traditional military standard, this tiny mercenary militia was completely outgunned and stood no real chance against the national armed forces. However, the relentless psychological manipulation, coupled with American-piloted airstrikes raining down on the capital city, sparked widespread hysteria. Paralyzed by the sheer chaos, and already compromised by foreign intelligence handlers, the national military simply laid down their arms. With his forces refusing to fight, the president was forced to resign on June 27, paving the way for Castillo Armas to seize power. The new regime instantly erased progressive policies, returning vast estates to the fruit conglomerate, crushing labor unions, and imprisoning thousands of dissidents. The report was enjoyed waiting for the sinister river. This orchestrated regime change plunged the nation into a ruthless military dictatorship, sparking a decades-long civil conflict that ultimately slaughtered hundreds of thousands. The American president proudly celebrated this grim victory as a perfect blueprint for foreign interference, a template later reused disastrously at the Bay of Pigs. Yet, even as the intelligence director was busy overthrowing sovereign governments overseas, he was simultaneously orchestrating a deeply unsettling shadow campaign on domestic soil. The intelligence chief harbored ambitions that went far beyond dominating other countries. His ultimate prize was absolute mastery over human consciousness itself. On April 13, 1953, he stood before a Princeton audience, publicly denouncing Soviet psychological conditioning as a vile affront to American ideals. Yet, just 3 days after that self-righteous speech, he covertly greenlit MK-Ultra, an entirely illegal CIA initiative dedicated to cognitive manipulation. Leadership of this dark project was handed to Sidney Gottlieb, a specialized chemist operating out of the agency's technical services branch. What started small rapidly expanded, eventually fracturing into 149 distinct, highly classified sub-operations scattered all across North America. This massive web of secrecy infiltrated 86 different institutions, secretly embedding itself within universities, medical centers, penitentiaries, and major pharmaceutical corporations. The official justification for this sprawling network was to engineer foolproof tactics for manipulating and breaking the human psyche. Operatives envisioned utilizing these psychological tools to extract confessions during interrogations and seamlessly execute highly sensitive, clandestine missions. They even explored the terrifying possibility of mentally programming individuals, forcing them to commit acts entirely against their own volition. This intense paranoia was rooted in genuine Cold War anxieties, especially following alarming reports of returning Korean War veterans who appeared completely brainwashed. A pervasive dread had gripped American leadership, convinced that their Soviet adversaries had already perfected advanced methods of psychological warfare. He hadn't been sure that he could have been so quickly. However, the extreme and unethical tactics greenlit by the CIA director eclipsed any reasonable defense based on protecting national security. Unwitting test subjects were secretly pumped full of LSD and various other psychoactive compounds, entirely without their permission or awareness. The victims of these hidden trials included inmates, psychiatric patients, sex workers, and everyday civilians who never suspected they were human guinea pigs. At a Montreal institute, a CIA-funded psychiatrist subjected victims to a torturous regimen of induced comas, severe electroshocks, and looped audio to rewrite their identities. The intelligence agency bankrolled Cameron's brutal methods through shell organizations, leaving countless victims with irreversible mental trauma. He failed to proceed with a dusting market. This unchecked experimentation bred immense distrust within the agency itself, as Gottlieb began targeting his own colleagues. In one infamous instance, he secretly slipped hallucinogens into the drinks of fellow operatives, just to monitor their behavior. Shortly after being covertly drugged in 1953, biochemist Frank Olson plummeted to his demise from a Manhattan hotel window. While officials quickly labeled the fatal fall a suicide, Olson's relatives later alleged he was assassinated to ensure his silence. To this day, the exact events surrounding the scientist's mysterious plunge remain a subject of fierce historical debate. By the dawn of the 1960s, agency leadership finally conceded that creating genuine mind-controlled operatives was an impossible fantasy. The sprawling initiative was discreetly shut down, but the desperate effort to erase its dark legacy had only just started. Hoping to bury the evidence forever, Director Richard Helms commanded the total obliteration of all project archives in 1973. The train roommate refused to take off the same source of global. Our current understanding relies almost entirely on a random stack of accounting papers that miraculously escaped the shredders. Late 70s congressional hearings tried to connect the remaining dots, yet the true magnitude of these horrors will likely stay hidden. But biological manipulation was merely one avenue Dulles pursued to artificially mold the American public's perception of reality. Alongside the clandestine medical trials, the agency orchestrated a highly coordinated crusade to dictate the nation's news consumption. Commonly referred to as Operation Mockingbird, this initiative successfully forged deeply entrenched alliances with powerful domestic news corporations. Spearheaded by covert ops chief Frank Wisner, the operation actively recruited respected editors and reporters to peddle state-sanctioned narratives. Once Dulles took the helm in 1953, this covert media manipulation network grew exponentially. A 1977 exposé by reporter Carl Bernstein in Rolling Stone magazine laid bare the sheer scale of the infiltration. Bernstein revealed that over 400 members of the U.S. press had been quietly running errands for intelligence officials. This vast roster implicated writers and editors at heavyweights like CBS, Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times. A number of these media figures were fully aware of their partnership, eagerly doing favors for the agency. Meanwhile, others were simply used as blind instruments, accepting planted tips from connected sources without grasping the hidden agenda. This immense influence was fully unleashed during the Guatemalan coup, as publishers like Henry Luce actively buried pro-Arbenz reporting. Dulles even stepped in personally to block a prominent New York Times correspondent from setting foot in Guatemala during the turmoil. However, this powerful propaganda machine wasn't solely focused on foreign affairs. It was readily weaponized against targets back home. When Senator Joseph McCarthy targeted the agency, loudly claiming they were sheltering communist sympathizers, retaliation was swift. With Dulles giving the green light, Wisner immediately mobilized his vast stable of cooperative journalists. Legendary broadcasters and columnists went on a relentless attack, orchestrating a media blitz that permanently dismantled McCarthy's public standing. Decades later, the 1975 Church Committee verified that this intelligence web included hundreds of overseas operatives shaping public opinion. These assets pumped covert propaganda directly into global news agencies, broadcast stations, and even major commercial book publishers. Furthermore, congressional investigators discovered that around 50 of those key operatives were actually direct employees of U.S. media organizations. The financial scale of this deception was staggering, with Senator Frank Church calculating a taxpayer bill of roughly $265 million annually. Let that sink in for a second. The very institution designed to safeguard democratic values was actively eroding the foundation of a free press. This systemic manipulation wasn't occurring in some remote dictatorship, but right on American soil, entirely orchestrated by Allen Dulles. However, as the world transitioned into the 1960s, this untouchable shadow empire finally collided with obstacles it couldn't simply manipulate away. The first major crack appeared in May 1960, when an American U-2 reconnaissance plane was blasted out of the sky over the Soviet Union. Not only was the aircraft destroyed, but the Soviets managed to capture the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, completely alive. This glaring blunder deeply humiliated both the CIA and the Eisenhower administration on the global stage. The diplomatic fallout was immediate, instantly derailing a highly anticipated peace summit between President Eisenhower and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. It was a massive public embarrassment that proved Dulles's supposedly flawless, invisible intelligence machine actually had severe limits. But the ultimate catastrophe wouldn't arrive until the following year, culminating in the infamous 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. Dulles had been mapping out this aggressive operation for months, intending to depose Fidel Castro using a specialized force of Cuban exiles. The entire strategy hinged on a crucial assumption that this coastal landing would ignite a massive civilian rebellion against Castro's regime. Unfortunately, that rebellion never materialized, exposing a mission riddled with faulty intelligence, sloppy logistics, and a deadly underestimation of Cuban forces. The assault team of roughly 1,400 men was swiftly decimated, leaving more than 100 dead and over 1,100 taken prisoner. A furious John F. Kennedy, who had hesitantly greenlit this inherited operation, now found himself bearing the absolute brunt of the catastrophic failure. The commander-in-chief's anger was legendary, with Kennedy allegedly declaring his desire to shatter the intelligence agency into 1,000 pieces. He wanted to scatter those remnants to the winds, ensuring the organization would never again wield such unchecked, disastrous power. Consequently, on November 29, 1961, the architect of countless covert operations was unceremoniously pushed out of his powerful role. Although he received the National Security Medal just a day prior, this token gesture barely masked the humiliation of his dismissal. Call 41-144 to have you done. After a decade reigning as the globe's ultimate puppet master, the man who overthrew foreign regimes had finally met his match. Ironically, this formidable spy master had been completely dismantled by a 36-year-old politician hailing from Massachusetts. Yet, the saga of the ousted director didn't conclude with his quiet retirement. His most polarizing act was still waiting in the wings. Fast forward to November 22, 1963, when the unthinkable happened. President Kennedy was fatally shot in the streets of Dallas. The assassination sent the entire country into a paralyzing state of mourning, desperately searching for answers in the darkness. The bottom of the tree had differed in the center office. A week later, newly sworn-in Lyndon B. Johnson formed a special investigative panel, famously remembered as the Warren Commission. Astoundingly, among the select few chosen to unravel this national tragedy was none other than the recently disgraced Allen Dulles. It was a deeply unsettling choice, placing a spy master directly terminated by the victim onto the very team investigating his murder. Here was an operative intimately familiar with state-sponsored murder, having orchestrated numerous assassination plots against leaders like Fidel Castro. The Fisher of Someday member is in Skylarge, Julia's colleague. Now, this very man sat in a prime position to steer the investigation, perfectly placed to shield his agency's darkest secrets from public eyes. Whether he protected the truth or buried it remains one of history's great mysteries. If you want us to uncover more shadow wars, make sure to subscribe.